In December 1992, Manchester faced a case so disturbing that detectives later said it belonged among the darkest chapters in British history, alongside the Moors murders. 16-year-old Suzanne Capper's ordeal revealed a level of suffering that shocked investigators, yet at the time, it barely made national headlines. That's because the nation was already consumed by another devastating story, the tragic death of James Bulger, a 2-year-old whose case gripped the country and dominated front pages. The media spotlight was so intense it even sparked debates about controversial films and their influence on young people. In the shadow of that coverage, Suzanne's case was overlooked, even though it remains one of the most disturbing in British history. But why did Suzanne's story fade so quickly, despite the shocking details, and how has it been remembered since? I'm Fiona, and this is Case Continued. Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of the Thursday Brief. Now, this case is one that really disturbs me, and it's quite close to home in the north of the UK. The reason I find it so disturbing is not just the brutality of what the victim had to endure, and just the heartbreaking story behind it all, but the fact that the media handled it quite strangely. There were other things going on in the UK at the time that were taking more focus, and that's not to say that those things shouldn't have had the focus. They absolutely should. But the media, I guess, stuck between a rock and a hard place, covered what they felt was the biggest story at the time. And this poor victim almost faded into obscurity as soon as she died. And when the case was picked up by the media, instead of focusing on the victim, they actually focused on things that they could link back to the other murder that was making the headlines. Suzanne Jane Capper was born on the 1st of September 1978, and she was known as a gentle, easily influenced girl who just longed for acceptance. From the age of 6, she spent much of her time at the home of a lady called Jean Powell, who had acted as a babysitter or caretaker to Suzanne since she was young. Life at Suzanne's own home had become really unstable after her mother, Elizabeth Dunbar, separated from her stepfather. Suzanne and her older sister Michelle briefly lived with the stepfather, while social services also became involved for a period, which resulted in Suzanne being in and out of the foster care system for a while. The available information indicates that Suzanne and her siblings received a lack of love and support and care from their mother, and at one point, their mother actually left the children to go and live with her boyfriend. By her teenage years, Suzanne's attendance at Moston Brook High School had become really sporadic, and she increasingly turned to Jean Powell's house as a place of refuge. Jean's home at 97 Langworthy Road in Moston was a small Victorian terrace, but beneath its ordinary exterior, it concealed a darker environment. Jean was involved in drugs and the handling of stolen vehicles, which created a chaotic atmosphere, drawing in a constant stream of visitors. Michelle Capper, Suzanne's sister, had actually lived there for a short time, but left in August 1992, uneasy with Jean's new circle of acquaintances, particularly Bernadette McNeely, who had recently moved in at number 91. Bernadette McNeely, a 24-year-old mother of 3, actually soon moved into Jean Powell's house with her children, and the two women even shared a bed in the downstairs dining room due to the lack of space. The house was reportedly described as being full of children, and it was a place where secrecy and control could flourish unchecked, hidden behind the everyday facade of a normal home. The area of Moston itself was known for its challenges. In the early 1990s, it did struggle with poverty and social problems that affected many of the families living there. And while it wasn't a lawless place, the neighbourhood did have higher rates of crime and hardship than other parts of Manchester. For a vulnerable teenager like Suzanne Capper, it was an environment where danger could quietly thrive, even in the most ordinary seeming streets. Jean, along with her friend Bernadette, reportedly humiliated Suzanne on a regular basis. Verbal jabs, intimidation, and subtle cruelty marked her visits, leaving her anxious and vulnerable. Yet Suzanne kept returning, drawn by a desperate need for acceptance, a fear of being left out, and perhaps the hope that her presence would just be enough to earn their approval. According to Michelle Capper, Suzanne wasn't acting out of fear by visiting the people she so badly wanted to be friends with. She simply wanted to be accepted and liked, and she would go to great lengths to please the women. Michelle said she would do anything for them. She pampered their every whim. Now, Suzanne did have friends, but her attendance at school had become quite bad, and obviously she was in and out of foster care, and this also had an impact on some of the people who wanted to be friends with her. So although she did have some friends, she wasn't what you would call the popular girl, and she was kind of on the margins sometimes. All she wanted was like a little girl gang of friends that she could spend time with, have fun with, and grow up with. Yet it always just seemed slightly out of arm's reach. Jean Powell, who of course had been in Suzanne's life for a long time, being much older than Suzanne, was somebody that Suzanne looked up to. And of course, there's that confidence that a teenager gets from having older friends. And with that also comes a certain type of street cred. It may have made her more popular if people knew that she was associating with older women who wanted to be her friend, wanted her to be around them. Jean's household was constantly filled with visitors. Her estranged husband, Glyn Powell, still dropped by from his nearby home. Anthony Dudson, the 16-year-old boyfriend of 24-year-old Bernadette McNeely, also spent time in the house, while simultaneously being romantically involved with 26-year-old Jean. This was not a normal household, and the relationships of the people within this household were, again, not normal. A 16-year-old boy in a sexual relationship with both a 24-year-old woman and a 26-year-old woman. Jeffrey Lee, a regular customer of the household's drug trade, and Clifford Pook, who was Jean's younger brother, were also frequent visitors as well. That household was a stream of people coming and going. It was chaotic, it was busy, and it was the ideal place for crimes to go unnoticed. All of these individuals combined to create this tangled web of toxic relationships, leaving Suzanne Capper, a really vulnerable teenager, trapped in a dangerous environment she didn't fully understand. Suzanne's nightmare began in early December 1992. She was lured to Jean Powell's house under the guise of a visit. Suzanne was actually immediately overpowered when she arrived. Jean, along with ex-husband Glyn and Anthony Dudson, restrained Suzanne, forcing her into a terrifying sequence of abuse. Her head and eyebrows were shaved, and she was made to gather the hair up and put it in the bin, a cruel ritual designed to humiliate and dominate. Even as Suzanne tried to protect herself, the assaults continued. Jean and Bernadette McNeely kicked her while she was curled up on the floor and struck her repeatedly with a long wooden instrument and a belt. Every moment was calculated to break Suzanne's will, with humiliation and violence tightly intertwined. In the bathroom, Jean, Bernadette, and Anthony claimed that the punishments were in retaliation. Bernadette and Anthony had contracted pubic lice and they blamed Suzanne, insisting that she was the one who had caused it. To exact their twisted sense of revenge, Suzanne was forced to shave her own pubic hair, a deeply humiliating act meant to mark her as the target of their wrath. By nightfall, she was locked inside a cupboard, left alone in the darkness. The following day brought no relief. Suzanne was moved upstairs and confined in another cupboard, the walls of her prison closing in further. On December the 8th, she was actually taken to Bernadette McNeely's home just a few doors up the road. There, in a back room, away from prying eyes, Suzanne was tied spread eagle to an upturned bed frame with electrical flex. Trapped in a position that left her completely vulnerable. For a girl who had only sought acceptance and companionship, the world she thought she knew had become a calculated landscape of terror where every interaction was a threat and every moment was a test of her endurance. Over the next 5 days, Suzanne endured a relentless cycle of abuse, each day escalating in cruelty. She was repeatedly beaten and force-fed amphetamines, forced to endure burns from cigarettes and lighters, and she had music blasting through headphones at deafening volumes. One track in particular, called Hi, I'm Chucky, Wanna Play, by 150 Volts, sampled from the Child's Play movie, was played repeatedly, and it was like the opening to each torment session announced by Bernadette McNeely, with the really disturbing words, Chucky's coming to play. At some point during that week, Clifford Pook and Jeffrey Lee arrived at the house and they found Suzanne bound and gagged, her eyes blindfolded. She'd been laying in her own waste for days, and her captors forced her into a bath of concentrated disinfectant, scrubbing her with a brush so harshly that her skin was scraped raw. The abuse escalated further. Using pliers, Pook extracted 2 of Suzanne's teeth. A horrifying act that he seemed to take great pleasure in and treated as a bit of a grotesque game. Anthony Dudson would later recount that scene in grim detail. Pook had removed Suzanne's gag, commanded her to open her mouth, and began striking her teeth with the pliers. When he realised that the teeth were just breaking and that the attempt to remove them by knocking them out was failing, he struck them again repeatedly and then finally wrenched them free with the pliers while laughing. By this stage, Suzanne's ordeal had reached a level of calculated brutality rarely seen. Each act designed not only to inflict physical pain, but to break her spirits completely. Every hour in that house tightened the grip of terror, leaving her trapped in a nightmare that she could neither escape nor fully comprehend. David Hill, just 18 at the time, was asked to sit in at the house, unaware of the horror unfolding behind these closed doors. From the back room, he could hear Dudson shouting, and he was curious and also a little bit alarmed. He didn't know what was going on, so he asked what was happening, and he was shown Suzanne Capper. Now, at this point, the evidence of abuse was clearly unmistakable. Later on, Hill found himself alone with Suzanne, desperate and pleading for help, but he didn't intervene. He said, "She asked me if I could help, but I told her I couldn't. I asked her who she was. She said her name was Suzanne. I said I couldn't do anything." Hill admitted that he was paralysed by fear, and he'd said that, "I thought they would batter me if I said anything. They'd all have gotten me. I didn't know what to do. I was too shocked to act." Meanwhile, Jeffrey Lee and Anthony Dudson just carried on as though nothing horrific was happening. They actually even assisted Suzanne's sister's fiancé, Paul Barlow, with his car, helping him with repairs on it, all the while knowing that Suzanne was in that home being tortured. Paul Barlow said a little bit later on, "They could have told me then and there. The door would have been kicked down and I would have gotten Suzanne out. I did not think that they were capable of such savagery. Now all I want is 10 minutes with them in a back room." The level of fear and control exercised over everyone in that house highlights just how isolated and powerless Suzanne had become, trapped in this nightmare that just seemed to widen with every passing hour. By mid-December, Suzanne's attackers were starting to panic that her family might actually report her missing, so they decided that she had to be removed from the house entirely. In the early hours of December the 14th, Suzanne was forced into the boot of a stolen white Fiat Panda. The journey was 15 miles to a narrow lane at Werneth Law on the outskirts of Stockport. In the car were Bernadette, Jean and Glyn Powell, and Anthony Dudson. Witnesses later reported that Bernadette seemed almost gleeful during this ride, giggling away as if it was some kind of fun game. When they reached the isolated lane, Suzanne was pushed down an embankment and into a tangled patch of brambles. And we can only imagine the pain at this point, with her body scrubbed raw from the disinfectant bath that she'd had. Bernadette poured petrol over her, but the liquid refused to catch immediately. Glyn Powell and Anthony Dudson made several more attempts before the flames finally took full hold of Suzanne's body. Bernadette McNeely was apparently standing in the background singing the lyrics to Disco Inferno, "Burn, baby, burn," turning this already horrific scene into a really grotesque spectacle. Convinced that Suzanne was dead, the group returned to Jean Powell's house, stopping along the way to buy cans of fizzy drinks, as if nothing had just happened. Back at the house, Jeffrey Lee and Clifford Pook were present, waiting, unaware or unwilling to fully grasp the magnitude of what had just taken place. After her attackers left, Suzanne Capper somehow managed to drag herself up the embankment, each movement agony, and stagger along the lane for roughly a quarter of a mile to Compstall Road. Her body was covered in severe burns, and yet she pressed on. At 6:10 a.m, Barry Sutcliffe and two colleagues, gentlemen on their way to work, discovered her. They quickly guided her to a nearby house and alerted the residents, Michael and Margaret Coop, who immediately called for an ambulance. Michael recalled the horrific sight. Both her hands looked like ash. Her legs were raw and her feet were badly burnt. Despite everything, she was incredibly polite, constantly thanking my wife for helping her. Margaret added, I instinctively tried to hold her, but she recoiled. She couldn't bear to be touched. Her head was shaved, her face was barely recognisable, and her hands and legs were raw and blistered. The pain she was in was unimaginable. Even in that state, Suzanne tried to drink, needing help to manage the glass. Her hands were too damaged to hold it herself. At the hospital, she mustered enough strength to give the names of all 6 attackers and Jean Powell's address before slipping into a coma. Her burns were so extensive that her mother and stepfather couldn't even recognise her, and formal identification had to be made through a partial fingerprint, the only part of her hands that had survived relatively unscathed. Suzanne never regained consciousness, and she passed away on December the 18th, 1992, leaving a trail of grief, shock, and outrage in her wake. The investigation into Suzanne Capper's death was led by Detective Inspector Peter Wall of Greater Manchester Police. At 7:30 a.m. on December the 14th, he ordered officers to go to 97 Langworthy Road and take everyone into custody. When the police arrived, Jean Powell and Bernadette McNeely were reportedly exchanging jokes and laughing as they were led away. At first, all 6 of the suspects denied any involvement, but under questioning, Anthony Dudson, actually encouraged by his father to tell the whole truth, began to reveal what had actually happened. D.I. Wall later described the moment that Dudson's statement came to light. As the story began to unfold, I just couldn't believe it. I kept asking myself how one human being could do this to another. Officers were completely overwhelmed by the horror of Suzanne's ordeal. Some just sat and sobbed at the station as the details emerged. They were so deeply moved that police and civilian employees actually pooled money together to send flowers to Suzanne in the hospital. By December the 17th, the 6 accused appeared before Manchester magistrates, remanded in custody and facing charges of kidnapping and attempted murder. On the 23rd of December, following Suzanne's death, the charges were updated to include murder, cementing the severity of their crimes and setting the stage for one of the most shocking cases in modern British history. The inquest into Suzanne Capper's death began on the 8th of January 1993 at Manchester Coroner's Court, and it was overseen by Leonard Gorodkin. Dr. William Lawler, a pathologist with a Home Office, gave really disturbing testimony. He explained that Suzanne had suffered burns over 75 to 80% of her body, consistent with being doused in petrol and Cetolite, and her injuries were so severe that the chances of survival had been virtually non-existent. Dr. Lawler stated, "It was clear from the outset that Suzanne was unlikely to survive. The burns were widespread and led to severe internal complications, confirming that her death resulted directly from these injuries." The coroner reflected on the suffering that Suzanne had endured, noting, "It is clear that this young girl must have endured immense pain and had no real chance of survival. Yet, she lived long enough to provide crucial information that led to those responsible being held accountable." Addressing Suzanne's mother and stepfather directly, he added, "On behalf of myself and the nation, I offer my deepest sympathy and condolences for this tragic loss of your daughter." The court proceedings began on the 16th of November 1993 and stretched over 22 intense days. Throughout, all 6 defendants denied involvement in Suzanne's death, each attempting to downplay their role in the harrowing events. The motives behind Suzanne's abduction were disturbingly trivial. Jean Powell, alleged that Suzanne had tried to convince her to sleep with a man for money. Bernadette McNeely and Anthony Dodson believed that they had caught pubic lice from a bed that Suzanne had used. And in what seems almost unimaginable pettiness, McNeely was convinced that Suzanne had stolen a pink duffel coat. Ridiculous petty grievances that culminated in the torture and murder of a 16-year-old girl. When the jury retired to deliberate on the 16th of December, it took them just under 10 hours to reach their decisions. The presiding judge reflected on the gravity of the crime. Each of you has been found guilty based on clear evidence of a murder that is as shocking and appalling as it is imaginable. Clifford Pook, however, was cleared of the murder charge by the judge's direction. The sentences handed down were severe for the British justice system. Bernadette McNeely was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years, later reduced by 1 year in 2013, also serving 20 years for conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm and 20 years for false imprisonment. Jean Powell was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years, plus 20 years each for conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm and false imprisonment. Glyn Powell, Jean's ex-husband, was convicted of murder with a life sentence and a 25-year minimum, along with 20 years each for conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm and false imprisonment. Jeffrey Lee, well, he pleaded guilty to false imprisonment and he received 12 years, but he was acquitted of murder and conspiracy charges. Anthony Dodson was found guilty of murder and detained indefinitely with an 18-year minimum, which was later reduced by 2 years in 2002. He also received 15 years for conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm and 15 years for false imprisonment. Clifford Pook pleaded guilty to conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm and false imprisonment and received 15 years for each, but he was also acquitted of murder. As the sentences were read, the courtroom was charged with emotion. 2 jurors sat and cried their eyes out, while cries of relief and vindication rang out from the public gallery, filled with Suzanne's family. Detective Inspector Peter Wall, reflecting on the nature of the offenders, told reporters, "Psychological assessments indicate that these individuals are sane. It is terrifying that such ordinary people could commit acts of this magnitude. There's nothing exceptional about them, just the horror of their choices." After the sentences were handed down, the story didn't end there. Jeffrey Lee actually successfully appealed his sentence, which was shortened from 12 years to 9 years on the 4th of November 1994. Anthony Dodson also saw his minimum term reduced from 18 years to 16 in 2002, though he argued again that the reduction was still insufficient, claiming the Lord Chief Justice had not properly considered his welfare. That second appeal was dismissed in November 2003. Anthony Dodson eventually moved to an open prison in 2009, a step closer to eventual release. In June 2012, Jean Powell and Bernadette McNeely were granted leave to have the length of their minimum sentences reviewed. Bernadette's term was cut by 1 year, though the shadow of controversy followed her around. While at HM Prison Durham in 1996, a routine check revealed letters showing she had been involved in a relationship with a prison governor, Mike Martin. He resigned before any formal disciplinary action could take place, and Bernadette was swiftly transferred to HM Prison Newhall, where she shared a wing with infamous offenders Rose West and Myra Hindley. Release dates came gradually over the following years. Jeffrey Lee was freed in 1998 and Clifford Pook followed in May 2001. Both released on licence. Anthony Dodson walked free in 2013, benefiting from the earlier reduction to his minimum term. Bernadette was released in 2015, described as a model prisoner, and Jean Powell followed in 2017. Most recently, Glyn Powell was released on licence in May 2023, bringing the final chapter of this case into the present day. The social backdrop of Moston and the surrounding areas of Manchester was a story of stark contrasts. While the city projected an image of growth, hosting international conferences and even vying to host the year 2000 Olympic Games, beneath the surface, life for many was far from prosperous. Housing was often described as barely holding together, and issues like homelessness, poverty, street violence, and a thriving drug culture were a harsh reality for those living in the city's most neglected neighbourhoods. Certain streets and blocks had gained reputations as dangerous no-go areas where muggings and petty crimes were common, and many residents actually rarely ventured outside after dark. In some parts, the grim realities of poverty and violence were actually inescapable, creating this landscape that formed the backdrop to the tragic events that would later unfold in Suzanne Capper's life. And the case shocked many, not just for the brutality of the crime itself, but for the unusual dynamics behind it. Observers noted that a gang was involved and that, unusually, 2 women were at the forefront, directing much of the abuse. Following the convictions of Jean Powell and Bernadette McNeely, media outlets began to speculate about the idea of girl gangs and a supposed rise in violent crimes committed by young women. Now, probation services and organisations working with ex-offenders found themselves inundated with journalists looking for examples to support this narrative of an emerging LA-style female gang culture on British streets. Mary Barnish, a senior probation officer, was very quick to caution against overgeneralising, and she said, "One woman does something somewhere, and immediately there's a moral panic. People assume it's an epidemic." Still, that data from the National Association of Probation Officers did show a rise in women being jailed for violent offences. Harry Fletcher, the association's Assistant General Secretary, emphasised that, much like the women in Suzanne's case, these individuals often came from backgrounds marked by neglect, abuse, substance problems, and low self-esteem, and many had themselves been victims of violence. Fletcher stressed that support and intervention were more important than incarceration. Yet the public and the press remained captivated by the sensational image of the female perpetrators. Over time, however, the role of women in such cases is often overshadowed, especially in cases where both men and women were involved. In Anthony Dodson's appeals, for example, national coverage highlighted the violent gang that he was part of, but many readers would never have realised that 2 of the gang's key figures were women who had orchestrated the torture of a young girl over something as trivial as a duffel coat. The moral panic surrounding Suzanne's murder extended far beyond the gender of her attackers, and the media quickly latched onto the idea of video nasties influencing criminals. At the same time as Suzanne's case was unfolding in the press, the nation was still reeling from the shocking killing of 2-year-old James Bulger in Liverpool. On the 12th of February 1993, CCTV cameras at the New Strand shopping centre in Bootle captured 2 10-year-old boys, Robert Thompson and John Venables, moving through the crowds with an unsettling calm. They lingered near groups of children, seemingly scanning the area for a potential target. That day, both boys had skipped school, a pattern that they repeated often, and they were spotted shoplifting small items. Sweets, batteries, a troll doll, and a can of blue Humbrol model paints. The two children would later go on to say that before the abduction of James, they'd even considered taking a child and leading them into traffic outside the shopping centre. Meanwhile, 2-year-old James Bulger was at the shopping centre with his mother, Denise, enjoying just a routine afternoon. At around 3:40 p.m, while she briefly let go of his hand just to pay at the butcher's counter on the lower floor, James disappeared. Just 2 minutes later, at 3:42 p.m, CCTV captured Thompson and Venables guiding James by the hand, quietly but deliberately, away from the busy shopping centre. In those few moments, the unthinkable began to unfold. Robert Thompson and John Venables led James Bulger to the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, just a short distance from where he'd been taken. They dropped him onto the hard ground, injuring his face, and cruelly joked about throwing him into the water. A witness later described seeing the toddler and said he was crying his eyes out, terrified and helpless. The boys then forced James to walk more than 2.5 miles across Liverpool. And during this time, around 38 people saw them, but very few intervened. And when they did, Thompson and Venables insisted that James was either their brother or a lost child that they were escorting to the police. At one point, the boys even took James to a pet shop, only to be thrown out by the owner. Unbelievable. So many adults had sight of James with his killers that day and did nothing. Eventually, the group reached Walton. The boys were hesitating a little bit around Walton Lane Police Station, and they could quite easily have left James there or taken the boy inside and just said that they'd come across him. He was wandering around, away from his parents, and they were just bringing him to safety. But they couldn't just do that. Instead, they led James up a steep embankment to a disused railway line. And here, their cruelty really escalated. Now, I really actually hate talking about this particular crime because it was so brutal. And we're talking about 2 10-year-old boys carrying out the most horrific of attacks on a 2-year-old defenseless boy. It is horrendous. Now, I am not a parent. I don't have children. That was my life choice. I am happy not to have them. It doesn't mean to say that I don't like children. I do. I have nieces and I have nephews and I have friends that all have children and they're great. I personally just didn't want my own. So I cannot even begin to think how a parent views this crime and this cruelty. Because as a non-parent, I find it beyond heartbreaking. And I do find it gives me a little bit of a lump in my throat when I'm trying to talk about what happened. So I'm going to try and keep it as brief as possible. Most of you will know of the James Bulger case anyway. And for those of you who don't, then you will find a wealth of information online. But I really don't want to take it too far. At the disused railway line, the boys threw the blue paint that they'd stolen earlier into his eyes. They kicked him, they stamped on him, they threw bricks at him, they threw stones on him, they forced batteries into his mouth, and finally they picked up a 10-kilogram railway fish plate and dropped it from height onto James, which left him with multiple skull fractures. Pathologists actually later recorded a total of 42 separate injuries, with no single blow being identified as the fatal one. After the attack, Thompson and Venables laid James's body down across the railway tracks, weighing his head down with rubble in a really disturbing attempt to make it look like a tragic accident. A train did eventually strike James after the boys had left the scene. 2 days later, 4 boys searching for footballs discovered James's body, and forensic examination confirmed that he had already died from the assault before the train hit him. The crime absolutely stunned the public. 2 children, barely old enough to understand the consequences of their actions, had committed an act of extreme violence. The case really challenged assumptions about age, innocence, and accountability, forcing society to confront really uncomfortable questions. How could children commit such a calculated act? What influences led them to this moment? And how could the law respond to offenders so young? The investigation quickly led police to Robert Thompson and John Venables, and both were arrested, evidence linking them directly to James's death. The legal proceedings that followed were unprecedented, as the 2 boys were tried in a system unaccustomed to dealing with offenders so young in such a serious case. The case dominated the headlines across the UK, and it also sparked widespread debate about child protection, media influence, and the justice system's role in handling violent acts committed by minors. Thompson and Venables were eventually convicted and sentenced, and they became the youngest convicted murderers in modern British history. One is particularly troublesome even to this day. Both boys have since served their time and been released back out into the wild. However, one seems to be absolutely incapable of behaving himself on the outside. Now, James Bulger's death left a lasting mark, not only on his family, who endured the most unimaginable grief, but on the nation as a whole. And this tragedy sparked changes in policing, child safety measures, and awareness of how vulnerable young children could be in public spaces, even for just a split second. The nation was absolutely gripped by the details of James' death, and the story really did dominate news coverage for weeks and months. Newspapers, television, and radio were absolutely consumed with the investigation. This trial of 2 young boys responsible for this appalling crime, and the wider questions that it raised about society, parenting, and child safety. But amid this intense media focus, Suzanne's story struggled to capture attention. The terrifying week that she endured, the abuse that she suffered, and her eventual death were largely overshadowed, leaving many people unaware of the full horror of what had actually happened to this poor girl. Now, this wasn't a reflection on the importance of her case. Rather, it was the unfortunate reality of timing and how news cycles and public attention work. Sometimes one story dominates headlines, leaving another equally tragic story behind in the shadows. And even now, when we look back at both cases, it's clear that Suzanne's suffering deserves to be remembered and understood in its own right, not as a footnote to another tragedy. And that's how the media really picked it up. Journalists immediately drew parallels between the 2 trials, largely because horror films were mentioned during the testimony. In Suzanne's case, Child's Play 3, a popular horror movie featuring that doll, Chucky, was played as music during her abuse. In the case of James Bulger, it was reported that the boys had actually watched the film and were recreating scenes from it. I have seen all the Chucky films. I do love a good horror film. They're not particularly films that I rate, but I have struggled to see where the boys were recreating direct scenes from the Chucky films from in the case of James Bulger. Yet the media went on and on and on about it. And these sensationalist headlines constantly suggested that the attackers in both cases had acted because of this horror film. And they wrote headlines like "Demonic Doll Chucky links the horror crimes," and The Curse of Chucky. Detective Inspector Wall was really clear. Interviews with the accused never ever indicated that child's play had motivated their actions, but this fact was completely overlooked in the rush to sell stories. Neither Jean Powell nor Bernadette McNeely even owned a video recorder, and the child's play inspired track, which was for some reason very popular at the time, had simply been taped from Manchester's local radio. They'd never seen the film. It's almost like journalists and the media were treating this film as a convenient scapegoat. And really, the same level of scrutiny just wouldn't exist if, the music in Suzanne's case had been Beethoven or Bach or a popular TV catchphrase. Yet the child's play narrative persisted, largely because it made a gripping story for readers and viewers. And, even in studies, Suzanne's case was actually cited as evidence, despite both police and the British Board of Film Classification confirming that no connection existed. I mean, the media focus on horror films and the supposed influence of Chucky even affected other movie releases, delaying the certification of films like Natural Born Killers and Reservoir Dogs, as authorities had to scramble to avoid controversy. In reality, the narrative around child's play actually overshadowed the very real social, psychological, and criminal factors that had led to Suzanne's abduction and death. Just as the tragedy of James Bulger had already highlighted the country's shock at the extremes of juvenile violence. What do you think could have been done differently to prevent this tragedy, if anything? Do you think there were missed opportunities for intervention? Or do you think there might have been warning signs that were overlooked? How do you feel about the way the media covered Suzanne's case compared to others at the time? Do you think society has learned enough from cases like this? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your perspective. Let's discuss, reflect, and make sure that stories like Suzanne's are never forgotten. Suzanne's story is a really disturbing reminder of how quickly cruelty can escalate when no one steps in. It shows how vulnerability, neglect, and violence can intersect with devastating consequences. But there is more to take away than horror. It's a lesson in awareness. In homes, in schools, in communities, warning signs can be missed. Voices can go unheard, and the smallest acts of intervention might actually make all the difference. Remembering Suzanne isn't just about looking back at what happened. It's about making sure we never forget the importance of protecting those who can't protect themselves. Every story, every witness, every small action matters. By paying attention, by asking questions, and by standing up, maybe tragedies like this one can be stopped before they ever begin. Suzanne's story challenges us to ask difficult questions, confront uncomfortable truths, and ensure that no voice goes unheard. And Suzanne's life might have been short, but her story still matters, and it's up to all of us to keep it alive. So thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode of the Thursday Brief, please make sure that you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss future videos. And also, please do share this with anyone you know who is into true crime. It really does help a small channel like mine, even if this video is only shared once. It allows me to keep doing what I am doing. And please don't forget, all you wonderful people out there, every other Monday or so, I do post deep dive videos where we get right into the nitty-gritties of cases like this one and leave no stone unturned. I would love for you to join me in those too. I will see you all in the next one, my friends. But in the meantime, stay curious, stay kind, and take care of yourselves. I've been Fiona, and this has been Case Continued.